The Dragon's Chosen One. Long ago, in a secluded valley untouched by war and greed, a young girl named Elara stumbled upon a dying creature. The dragon hatchling, barely larger than a hunting hound, lay curled in a nest of fallen leaves, its silvery scales dulled by dirt and blood. Elara knelt beside it, her heart aching at the sight of its frail body. Despite the warnings of elders that dragons were dangerous, she could see only its suffering. With hands as gentle as the morning breeze, she tended to its wounds, feeding it small pieces of fish and whispering soothing words as its golden eyes flickered open. For months, she nursed the little beast back to health, naming it Zephron. The process was anything but easy. At first, the hatchling was too weak to eat on its own, and Elara spent hours carefully mashing up fish and feeding it in small bites, her patience tested each day. Finding food was another struggle, as the villagers were wary of dragons and would not sell her enough meat to sustain him. She resorted to sneaking into the river at dawn to catch fish herself, often slipping on the wet rocks or enduring the chill of the early morning mist. Gaining Zephron's trust was perhaps the hardest challenge of all. The dragon, despite its frailty, had a fierce and untamed spirit. It hissed and snapped at her when she tried to clean its wounds, its golden eyes filled with fear. Elara bore the scratches and bites with silent determination, never raising her voice or showing anger. Slowly, day by day, the hatchling began to recognize her kindness. The first time he nudged her palm with his snout, seeking comfort instead of recoiling, Elara knew she had finally earned his trust. She learned how to communicate with him, watching the way his tail flicked in agitation or how his pupils widened in fear. She whispered to him under the stars, telling him stories of the world beyond the valley, and in return, he rumbled softly, as if sharing his own thoughts. When Zephron finally spread his wings for the first time, attempting a shaky flight over the treetops, Elara felt a swell of pride, as though she too had learned to soar. As it grew stronger, she taught it to hunt, to fly, to survive in a world that feared its kind. In return, Zephron became her closest companion, soaring through the skies while she raced through the forests below. But as Elara neared her 13th year, Zephron had grown too large to stay. One crisp autumn morning, it let out a deep, sorrowful rumble before taking flight, vanishing into the vast blue sky. Heartbroken, Elara watched until he disappeared beyond the mountains. Though she knew this day would come, it did nothing to ease the ache in her chest. She continued her life becoming a skilled healer and hunter, but she never forgot her first friend. Years passed, and Elara had long since believed that her bond with Zephron was only a memory. That was until the day the sky darkened with the shadows of enormous wings. The village erupted into chaos, farmers and merchants scrambling for safety. But as Elara looked up, her heart pounded with something other than fear. Zephron had returned, his massive form cut through the sky, his once silvery scales now darkened with age and streaked with deep sapphire hues. His golden eyes, once filled with youthful uncertainty, now burned with wisdom and recognition as they locked onto Elara. The powerful gust from his wings sent dust swirling, and as he descended, the villagers gasped in awe at the sheer majesty of the great dragon who had once been nothing more than a fragile hatchling in Elara's care. But he was not alone. A cluster of dragons circled above, their massive forms silhouetted against the sun. Among them were hatchlings, some strong, others clinging weakly to their mothers. Then, before the eyes of the stunned villagers, Zephron descended, landing with a powerful gust of wind that sent dust swirling. He lowered his head toward Elara and let out a deep, familiar hum. Elara stepped forward cautiously, her breath caught between disbelief and awe. Then she saw it, a small dragon, frail and trembling, nestled against Zephron's talons. The great dragon nudged the hatchling toward her. Understanding dawned in Elara's heart. He was entrusting her with his weakest young. As she reached out, the hatchling let out a pitiful chirp and nestled into her hands. Her chest tightened, How could she refuse? She took the small creature into her arms and held it close. But she was not the only one who took notice. Crown Prince Kael had spent his life studying dragons, sworn to protect them as the kingdom's future ruler. As a child, he had been fascinated by them, sneaking into the royal dragon stables to watch the hatchlings interact with their mothers. He had once tried to feed a newborn dragon, only to receive a playful but firm nip that left a scar on his wrist, a reminder that trust with dragons had to be earned, not given freely. That lesson had shaped his entire life, driving him to study their ways, their needs, and the unspoken bond between them and their chosen riders. From the moment he could walk, he had been immersed in their world, learning their language, their customs, their ways of choosing those worthy of their trust. Dragons were revered in the kingdom, but they were also selective, never offering their allegiance lightly. Only the bravest and kindest souls were allowed into their ranks, and even then, trust was earned, not given. Kael had dedicated himself to ensuring the safety and survival of these magnificent creatures, forming a deep bond with his own dragon, Seraphania, but his path had been anything but easy. From a young age, he had been thrust into the rigorous training of the royal warriors, expected to lead not just men but dragons. His father, the king, had been strict, believing that strength was forged in hardship. Kael had spent years proving himself, enduring grueling combat drills, sleepless nights deciphering ancient dragon lore, and enduring the brutal physical tests that determined who was worthy of standing beside the kingdom's revered dragons. When he first approached Seraphania as a boy, she had been wild and untamed, wary of human hands. It had taken months of patience, countless failed attempts, and a near-fatal encounter with another dragon before she finally accepted him. He had earned her trust not with dominance but with understanding. He learned that dragons did not follow orders. They chose their riders based on character, on bravery and kindness, rather than strength alone. The day she lowered her great head and allowed him to touch her scales, he knew he had found not just an ally, but a lifelong companion. Yet despite his success, Kael was always aware of the opposition within his own court. Many noble families saw dragons as weapons, tools to be harnessed for power, rather than revered creatures with free will. He had spent years fighting against such beliefs, advocating for a future where dragons and humans coexisted, rather than ruled over one another. And now seeing Zephron entrust his young to a human girl, something unheard of even among the royal guards, Kael was determined to understand why. Perhaps in Elara he had found someone who shared his vision for a different world. Seraphania was a radiant beast with shimmering sapphire scales and eyes like molten gold. She had been his companion since boyhood, a creature that had tested him, challenged him, and ultimately chosen him. Just as Zephron had chosen Elara. The parallels between them were undeniable, and Kael couldn't ignore the feeling that fate had brought their paths together. When the dragons of the royal guard chose their warriors, it was considered the highest honor in the realm. Yet never before had a dragon taken its hatchlings outside the sanctuary of the royal den, where only the most trusted of warriors were granted entry. This alone intrigued Kael, but when he saw Zephron, one of the oldest and most formidable dragons, entrust a frail hatchling to a human girl, his curiosity turned to fascination. Hidden among the crowd, Kael watched in awe as Elara cradled the hatchling with tender care. Zephron, a dragon known to be wary of humans, had chosen this woman to nurture his young. Why? What made her worthy of such an honor? Kael urged Seraphania into the sky, trailing Zephron from a distance. He needed to understand the meaning behind this unprecedented choice, his mind racing with questions as the wind rushed past him. Never before had a dragon entrusted its young to a human, especially not one outside the royal guards. The significance of such an act could not be ignored, and Kael needed to see for himself what made Elara so different. Determined to understand, Kael decided to follow her. Elara carried the fragile hatchling deep into the woods, whispering reassurances as she entered her small cottage. With careful hands, she wrapped the baby dragon in warm blankets and fed it small bits of meat, rubbing its scales gently when it shivered. Unknown to her, Kale observed from a distance, his curiosity deepening into admiration. For days he watched as she nurtured the young creature, treating it not as a beast, but as a child in need. He saw the way she sang to it, how she soothed its whimpers in the night, how she defended it fiercely when villagers whispered of danger. Finally, Kale could remain in the shadows no longer. One evening, as Elara stood by the river filling a pail of water, he stepped forward. "You have a rare gift," he said, his voice smooth but laced with wonder. Elara turned sharply, her gaze meeting his. "Who are you?" Kyle removed his hood, revealing his regal features. "Prince Kale of Eldoria, and you? You are unlike anyone I have ever met." Suspicion flickered in Elara's eyes. "Why are you here?" He hesitated, then admitted, "To understand why the dragons trust you. And perhaps to understand you." Her wariness did not fade, but neither did she turn him away. Over time, as the hatchling grew stronger under her care, so too did the bond between Elara and Kale. He admired her devotion, her courage, her kindness. And she, despite her reluctance, found herself drawn to the prince's sincerity, his passion for protecting the creatures she loved so dearly. Together they dreamed of a future where dragons and humans lived in harmony. But danger lurked beyond the kingdom's borders. Not all saw dragons as allies, some saw them as threats, as prizes to be hunted, their magic harvested for power. When word spread of a new dragon sanctuary, enemies moved in the shadows, and when the hatchling Elara had raised was stolen in the dead of night, she and Kale knew they could not stand idly by. Side by side, they embarked on a perilous journey to reclaim what was taken. Through treacherous mountains and enemy territory, they fought with unwavering resolve, their growing love tested by fire and blood. The journey was anything but easy. The first leg of their travels forced them through the Icefang Pass, where the relentless cold gnawed at their bones and the winds howled like wailing spirits, whispering through the jagged peaks. Their only warmth came from the hatchling, whom Elara kept wrapped in her cloak, and the occasional breath of fire from Seraphania. Kale often offered his own cloak to shield Elara from the brutal winds, their closeness sparking something unspoken between them. When they descended into the Valley of Thorns, they encountered mercenaries, men who had long hunted dragons for sport and profit. A battle erupted under the moonlight, their swords clashing with the enemy's steel. Elara fought with the precision of a hunter, her daggers finding their marks while Kale defended her flank, his blade swift and unrelenting. When an arrow grazed Elara's shoulder, Kale was at her side in an instant, his touch more protective than royal duty required. "You shouldn't have to fight like this," he murmured, pressing a cloth to her wound. Elara met his gaze, her breath unsteady. "If I don't, who will?" He had no answer, only admiration in his eyes. As the days stretched into nights, their stolen glances grew longer, the tension between them thick with unspoken words. One evening, as they camped near a river, Kale found her tending to the hatchling beneath the silver light of the stars. "You truly love them, don't you?" he asked softly. Elara looked up, her fingers brushing over the dragon's soft scales. "They have no one else to fight for them, just like you and me." Kale knelt beside her, his hand reaching out to cup her cheek. "You're unlike anyone I've ever known, Elara, and I fear I could lose myself in you." Her breath caught, but before she could respond, a rustle in the distance reminded them of the dangers still lurking. The moment was lost, yet the promise in his words lingered between them. Each battle, each hardship only pulled them closer. During one skirmish in the dense forests bordering enemy territory, Elara was nearly taken captive when an ambush separated them. She fought fiercely, but a well-aimed strike sent her crashing into the undergrowth, dazed and vulnerable. Kyle arrived just in time, cutting down her attacker with swift precision before gathering her in his arms. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently, brushing a stray leaf from her cheek, his eyes filled with worry. "I'm fine," she whispered, though her body trembled from exhaustion. Kyle didn't let go immediately. Instead, his hand lingered against her face, his thumb tracing the curve of her jaw. "I can't bear to see you like this," he murmured. Elara swallowed, caught in the intensity of his gaze. "I can take care of myself, Kale." "I know," he said, his voice softer now. "But that doesn't mean I won't fight for you." Later that night, as they rested by the fire, Elara caught him watching her, his expression unguarded in the flickering glow. His amber eyes traced her features with an intensity that made her heart stutter. He had seen her in battle, fierce and relentless, but here, in the quiet of the night, he saw something else. A softness in the way she cradled the sleeping hatchling, a quiet determination in the set of her jaw. Kyle felt something stir within him, something he had tried to push away. She was unlike anyone he had ever met, not just because of her bond with the dragons, but because of the fire that burned within her, a fire that refused to be extinguished by hardship or fear. He wanted to tell her, but the words felt too heavy, too soon. Instead, he simply watched, memorizing the way the firelight danced across her face, knowing that, for the first time in his life, he was looking at someone he didn't want to let go of. "What is it?" she asked. Kyle hesitated, then shook his head with a small smile. "Nothing. Just wondering how I got so lucky to have you by my side." Elara's heart pounded, and she found herself smiling back. "I think the dragons had something to do with it." And when at last they stood before the stolen dragon, battered but victorious, Elara knew one thing with certainty. Love was not only in whispered promises or gentle touches. Love was in the battles fought together, in the dreams shared, in the sacrifices made for something greater. As the rescued hatchling nuzzled against her, Kale took her hand in his eyes filled with unspoken words. Elara met his gaze, breathless, as the weight of everything they had endured pressed upon them. The stars shimmered above, casting a silver glow over the battlefield, illuminating the quiet understanding between them. Kale stepped closer, lifting his free hand to brush a stray lock of hair from her face. "Elara," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I have never admired anyone the way I admire you. Never cared for someone like this." Her heart pounded as she searched his face, seeing the same longing that burned within her reflected in his amber eyes. She had fought alongside him, bled beside him, and now, in this moment of peace, she knew she did not want to face the world without him. Slowly, Kale leaned in, hesitating only for a heartbeat before pressing his lips to hers. The kiss was soft at first, as though they were both testing the fragile reality of this moment. But then Elara melted into him, her arms wrapping around his neck as the depth of their emotions ignited. Like dragon fire. He pulled her closer, one hand cradling the back of her head, the other still clasping hers, unwilling to let go. When they finally parted, their breaths mingling in the cool night air, Kale rested his forehead against hers. "No matter what comes next, we face it together." Elara smiled, her fingers tightening around his. Together. And in that moment, beneath the vast starlit sky, love and duty found a way to coexist. Kale took a deep breath, his expression thoughtful. "Elara, come with me to Eldoria. The dragons need you, and I need you. I want you by my side, helping to care for them, to ensure their survival. And more than that, I want you to train as a warrior. You have the heart of one already. Let me help you learn to defend yourself and the dragons you love so fiercely." Elara hesitated, the weight of his words pressing upon her. She had always been independent, always fought her own battles. But the idea of standing beside Kale, of training to protect not just the dragons but herself, stirred something deep inside her. She looked at the hatchling nestled in her arms, now strong, its once frail wings spreading wide in the moonlight. This was her purpose. This was where she belonged. "I will go with you," she whispered, her voice steady. "But not just for the dragons. For us. Kale's face broke into a rare, genuine smile. For us. With Seraphania leading the way, they took to the skies at dawn, the healthy hatchlings soaring beside them. The journey back to Eldoria was filled with quiet conversations, lingering glances, and a newfound understanding between them. As the kingdom's towering spires came into view, Elara knew her life was about to change forever. And for the first time in years, she embraced it, stepping toward her future with unshaken resolve. At first, Elara had been filled with excitement, eager to prove herself among the warriors of Eldoria. She had imagined training alongside them, forging bonds through shared battles and hardship. But fitting into the warriors of Eldoria was far more difficult than she had expected. The rigorous training sessions pushed her to the brink of exhaustion, her muscles aching with every strike and counterstrike she learned. The instructors were ruthless, demanding perfection, and though Kale had promised to support her, he did not interfere, knowing she had to earn her place on her own. At dawn, she rose before the others, practicing her footwork and sparring against wooden dummies until her hands blistered. She struggled to match the seasoned warriors, her movements too slow, her strikes too hesitant. Time and time again, she was knocked down during combat drills, her opponents showing no mercy. Each failure was met with scoffs and whispers from those who doubted her. One day, during an intense weapons training session, she faced off against a veteran warrior. The woman was quick, experienced, and relentless. Within moments, Elara found herself on the ground, her sword skidding across the dirt. A chorus of laughter followed. "Pathetic," one of the onlookers sneered. "She'll never be one of us." Despite the stinging humiliation, Elara refused to stay down. Gritting her teeth, she retrieved her weapon, squared her stance, and demanded another round, and another, until she no longer stumbled, until she no longer flinched. In the evenings, after the others had retired, she trained alone. Kyle often found her in the courtyard, swinging her sword at unseen enemies, her face set with fierce determination. He never interrupted, only offering quiet encouragement when she needed it most. "You're improving," he murmured one night, wrapping a bandage around her bruised wrist. "But strength isn't just about fighting. It's about endurance. And you have more of that than anyone here." The road was grueling, but Elara refused to give in, and though the warriors still looked at her with skepticism, she knew that soon she would prove them all wrong. Even as she pushed herself beyond exhaustion and bore every bruise with silent determination, some of the other female warriors remained less than welcoming. Their skepticism lingered, their whispers sharp as blades, dismissing her efforts as nothing more than favoritism granted by Kale and Zephron. No matter how much she trained, there were those who refused to see her as an equal. "Must be nice having the prince's favor," one sneered as Elara wiped sweat from her brow after a grueling training session. "Some of us had to earn our place here." "She's nothing but a charity case," another whispered, just loud enough for Elara to hear. Zephron had given her his trust, but trust alone did not make a warrior. She doesn't belong with real warriors. Elara bit her tongue, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. She had never sought privilege, never expected special treatment, only the chance to prove herself on her own merit. She had fought for everything she had, and yet they only saw the prince's protection, not the scars and sacrifices she had endured. The taunts didn't stop there. During meals, they would take the seat closest to Kyle before she could, cutting her out of conversations, making her feel like an outsider in a place she desperately wanted to belong. At night, whispers haunted her, cruel words laced with jealousy and resentment. One evening, after an especially exhausting day, Elara found herself cornered in the training yard by the same group. "You're weak," one of them sneered, stepping closer. "You don't deserve the title of warrior. The only reason you're here is because of Kale and that overgrown lizard of yours." Anger burned in Elara's veins, but before she could reply, a deep rumbling growl echoed through the courtyard. The warriors stepped back, faces paling as a massive shadow descended from the sky. "Zephron," His golden eyes blazed with fury as he landed with a powerful gust of wind, his massive form towering over them all. He let out a low snarl, wings unfurling, sending dust and leaves scattering in every direction. The warriors who had tormented Elara scrambled backward, their bravado crumbling in the face of the ancient dragon's wrath. Zephron lowered his head, pressing his snout against Elara's shoulder in a gesture of reassurance. She placed a trembling hand on his scales, drawing strength from his presence. Kyle arrived moments later, his expression darkening as he took in the scene. A cold fury simmered beneath the surface, his jaw tightening, as his gaze flickered between the frightened warriors and Elara. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, the protective instinct within him roaring to the forefront. He had seen Elara struggle, push herself to exhaustion, and fight to earn her place, only to be met with cruelty. The injustice of it made his blood burn. "What's going on here?" One of the warriors stammered. Nothing, Your Highness. We were just talking." Kale's eyes flickered to Elara, his gaze filled with concern, searching for any sign of distress. He wanted to ask if she was all right, but the look in her eyes, hurt, determination, and a trace of exhaustion, told him more than words ever could. A whirlwind of emotions churned inside her: frustration at being targeted, relief at Zephron's unwavering support, and a flicker of vindication as the warriors cowered before the great dragon. But beneath it all, a lingering sadness clung to her heart. No matter how hard she fought, she still had to prove herself again and again. She met Kale's gaze and straightened her shoulders, willing herself to stand strong. "It's fine," she said, though the tightness in her voice betrayed her. But Kale wasn't convinced. His gaze swept over the group, his voice like steel. "Anyone who questions Elara's place here questions my judgment, and the judgment of the dragons, and that is not something I take lightly." A heavy silence settled over the courtyard. The warriors exchanged uneasy glances, some shuffling their feet while others cast their eyes downward, their earlier confidence crumbling under Kale's unwavering scrutiny. A few murmured apologies, their voices barely audible over the steady breathing of the great dragon beside Elara, who stood tall, her resolve unwavering. None dared to meet Kale's piercing stare, or risk the wrath of the great dragon that stood beside Elara. They knew better than to challenge him. As the group dispersed, Kale turned back to Elara, his expression softening. "You never have to prove yourself to them. You've already proven yourself to me." And to Zephron. Elara smiled faintly, reaching up to touch Zephron's snout. "I know, but I still want to earn my place, not just because of you or him, but because I want to be strong enough to stand on my own." Kale studied her for a moment before nodding. "Then I will stand by you while you do." As Zephron let out a contented rumble, Elara knew that, no matter what, she was not alone.